The blood pooled fast, faster than anyone expected. One moment she was standing between a trained military dog and a man with a knife. The next, she was on the wet concrete of a hospital courtyard, her body folded in on itself, 5 stab wounds bleeding through her scrubs, while the dog she had just saved stood over her like something ancient and ferocious and unwilling to let anything else touch her. Nobody at Greystone Regional Medical Center saw it coming. That was the problem. They never saw her coming. Not when she walked through their doors 3 years ago. Not when she quietly outperformed every trauma nurse on the floor. Not when she absorbed their condescension and their eye rolls and their small, cutting dismissals with a patience that should have been their first warning. A soldier never announces herself twice. If this story hits you, stay until the end. Leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The overnight shift at Greystone Regional Medical Center started like it always did, with the particular kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. Maya Reeves laced her sneakers in the staff locker room at 6:47 p.m., double knotting the left one the way she always did since it kept coming loose during a 12-hour floor shift. Around her, the outgoing day nurses were already peeling off their badges, trading complaints about the attending physicians and the broken pneumatic tube system in Zone B and the coffee machine that had been temporarily out of service for 11 days running. Maya listened without contributing. She had learned early that the locker room was where hospital politics lived and bred, and she had no interest in feeding that particular animal. She pulled her dark hair back into a low knot, checked her watch, a battered G-Shock she'd had since Fort Lewis, and walked out to the ER floor. The ER at Greystone on a Tuesday in January was its own special kind of chaos. Pelham Falls, Maryland was not a large city, but it sat at the intersection of 2 state highways and within 20 minutes of 3 major industrial facilities, which meant that the ER absorbed the spillover of everything. Car accidents on Route 9, equipment injuries from the Hartwell processing plant, frostbite cases from the homeless encampment under the Colson Street overpass that the city kept promising to address and never did. Maya had worked nights here for almost 3 years. She knew the rhythms of the building the way she once knew the rhythms of a FOB. Which hours were quiet, which were not, where the pressure would build before it broke. She picked up her first chart from the board and scanned it on her way to Bay 4. Behind her, she heard Dr. Garrison Foyle's voice before she saw him. That was usually how it worked. Foyle was the senior attending on nights, mid-50s, trim and silver-haired, with the particular brand of self-certainty that came from spending 30 years as the smartest person in rooms that had never once challenged him. Reeves. He said her name the way someone might say maintenance request. Flat, functional. The family in Bay 7 is asking for a status update on the troponin results. Handle it. Maya paused. I'm headed to Bay 4. Crawford's assigned to 7. Crawford is in radiology. You're here. Handle it. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she nodded and changed direction. It wasn't worth it. It was never worth it with Foyle. She had tried, in her first months here, to establish some basic professional boundaries, to push back when he rerouted her workload arbitrarily, when he dismissed her clinical observations without looking at them, when he referred to her in front of patients as my nurse, as if she were furniture he'd personally selected. It had not gone well. The charge nurse at the time had pulled her aside and advised her, gently but clearly, that Dr. Foyle was a significant donor to the hospital foundation and that certain adjustments in expectation would be in everyone's best interest. Maya had adjusted her expectations. She had not adjusted herself. She spent the first 3 hours of her shift moving with controlled efficiency through a floor that was understaffed by 2 nurses and over capacity by 11 patients. She triaged a possible MY in Bay 2 and flagged it to Foyle before he noticed the EKG himself, which she suspected irritated him. She reinserted an IV line in Bay 9 that a junior resident had blown twice, and she did it without comment, without drama, with a steady hand that the patient, a 64-year-old retired electrician named Leonard, who had been grimacing for 40 minutes, visibly relaxed at. You've done this before, Leonard said, watching her. Once or twice, Maya said. Military? She glanced up briefly. What makes you say that? The way you move, he said. My son-in-law was a corpsman. You've got the same thing, like you're always accounting for something. Maya pressed a piece of tape over the catheter and smoothed it flat. 7 years, she said. Army medic, 2 deployments. Leonard nodded slowly. Thank you for your service. It was the phrase people said because they didn't know what else to say, and Maya had long since stopped expecting it to mean anything in particular. But something in how this old man said it, quiet, without theater, made her meet his eyes for a moment. Thank you for letting me fix your IV, she said, and he laughed, and she moved on. By 10 p.m., the ER was running hot. A 3-car accident on Route 9 flooded them with 6 new patients inside of 20 minutes, and Maya went into a mode she rarely let herself inhabit here, a focused, stripped-down operational state where everything non-essential dropped away and only the work remained. She assessed. She communicated. She moved. Foyle was shouting instructions across the floor with the urgency of a man who'd discovered urgency approximately 40 minutes after it mattered, and the junior residents were scrambling, and Maya was already 2 steps ahead of all of it, reading the room, anticipating where the next break would come. It was Dominic Yates, another night nurse, younger, newly certified, someone Maya had quietly mentored through his first 6 months on the floor, who caught up with her between bays. There's a patient incoming, he said, slightly breathless. ETA 4 minutes. Foyle's already in a state about it. What's the presentation? Hypertensive crisis, possible internal bleeding, history of traumatic injury, but that's not the part. Dominic hesitated, and Maya recognized in that hesitation the specific flavor of there is something unusual happening that I'm not sure how to categorize. The dog, he said. Patient's coming in with a K9, a military working dog. Handler insisted it comes. Maya absorbed this. Where's the dog going? That's the argument Foyle is currently losing. She was already moving toward the ambulance bay. She got there just as the paramedics came through the doors, controlled urgency, a gurney with an IV already running, an older man strapped in with the particular stillness of someone in serious pain who had decided not to waste energy on its expression. He was maybe 55, broad-shouldered but lean, in the way that came from a lifetime of physical discipline rather than vanity. His face was gray-white beneath a week of beard growth. His breathing was shallow but measured. And beside the gurney, barely restrained on a lead held by one of the paramedics, was the dog. He was a Belgian Malinois, dark-sabled, probably 80 pounds, with amber eyes that swept the room with an alertness that was categorically different from any animal Maya had encountered in a hospital setting. This was not a pet who'd come along for comfort. This was a working animal in a foreign environment, and the difference was visible in every line of him. The set of his ears, the tension in his hindquarters, the way his eyes went to the patient on the gurney, and then back to the room, and then back to the patient with a frequency that suggested he was running his own kind of triage. His name, Maya would later learn, was Dax. The patient's name was Warren Okafor. Foyle materialized at Maya's shoulder. The animal cannot be in this facility, he said, loud enough that it wasn't really addressed to anyone specific, but was aimed in its vague way at the room. Hospital policy, liability, the paramedic should never have... The paramedic didn't have a choice, one of the medics said, not looking up from the gurney. Mr. Okafor would not get in the ambulance without the dog. We were burning time. That is not a sufficient... The dog is a registered military service animal, the other paramedic said. Federal designation. So if you want to have that conversation, sir, I'd suggest you get your legal department on the phone before you finish that sentence. Foyle's jaw tightened. He turned to Maya, not because she was the right person to solve the problem, but because she was standing there and he needed somewhere to direct his frustration. Deal with the animal, he said. Get it out of my ER. Maya looked at Dax. The dog was watching Warren's gurney disappear through the bay doors with an intensity that bordered on distress. His handler, a young paramedic who clearly had no idea what she was holding, was being steadily pulled toward the doors. Maya walked to the dog. She didn't crouch down, didn't make noise, didn't reach out. She just moved into his sightline and stood there, letting him register her. His ears were forward, body taut. His amber eyes moved to her face. Hey, she said quietly. He's going to be okay. Dax looked at her for a long moment. Then, by degrees so small they were almost invisible, the tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Maya took the lead. "I'll take him out to the south courtyard," she told Dominic without looking back. "Tell Foyle it's handled." The courtyard on the south side of Greystone was a narrow strip of landscaped concrete. A few benches, some winter-dead boxwoods, a chain-link gate that connected to the service road. It was empty at this hour, the kind of in-between space that hospitals built to suggest wellness and then promptly forgot. The air was brutal. 22 degrees, a wind cutting across the flat Maryland plain with nothing to stop it. Maya didn't mind. She'd stood post in worse. She found a bench against the building's exterior wall and sat. Dax stood a few feet away, oriented toward the hospital doors. She let him settle at his own pace, which was how you handled working dogs. Not with reassurance you hadn't earned, but with stillness that signaled control of the environment. After a few minutes, he sat. "There you go," Maya said. She was looking at him when her peripheral vision caught the gate. It moved, not from wind. A deliberate rattle. Testing. She was on her feet before she'd consciously processed the decision, already angling her body to put herself between Dax and whatever was at the fence, because it was that kind of movement. She had seen it before in places where a rattled gate meant something other than a shortcut. The gate swung open. The man who stepped through was heavy-set, maybe 35, wearing a construction jacket that hung wrong on the left side. Too much weight there, something concealed. His right hand was visible. His left was in his pocket. He was breathing through his nose in deliberate pulls, which was how people breathed when they were managing adrenaline. His eyes went immediately to Dax. "Back away from the dog," he said. Maya's voice came out flat and even. "Hospital property. You need to leave." "I'm not talking to you." He took a step forward. His left hand came out of his pocket. The knife was a fixed blade, maybe 6 inches. He held it with familiarity. Thumb on the spine, edge angled forward. He'd done this before. "Last time," Maya said. She was doing the calculation she'd learned to do in places where calculation was how you survived. Distance, angle, what she had to work with. She had nothing, no equipment, no backup, and about 3 seconds before this became something she couldn't talk down. "The dog comes with me," the man said. "That's the deal you've got. You stay out of it, you don't get hurt." Dax had risen from his sit. His body was rigid, all that controlled energy coiled into something that was no longer even trying to look domestic. Maya looked at the man with the knife, his flat eyes, his deliberate breathing, and she understood with complete clarity that he had not come here impulsively. He had followed someone. He had waited. He had come through a hospital courtyard in the middle of January with a fixed blade knife for a specific purpose, and he had the patience of someone who'd done this kind of waiting before. She held the lead tighter. "No," she said. He moved fast. People like this always moved fast. They banked on the shock freezing you, on the knife making your legs go stupid before your brain could issue instructions. It worked on most people. Maya Reeves was not most people. She didn't run. She moved into him, inside the arc of the knife, inside the distance where the blade was longest, because that was the counterintuitive truth that combat taught you. Close was sometimes safer than far. Her left arm went up. She took the first cut across her forearm, fire, immediate, real, and drove her elbow into his face. He staggered, not down, but back. Dax hit him like a wall. There was no other word for it. The dog moved from still to full extension in something under 2 seconds, 70-plus pounds of trained muscle finding the knife arm with a precision that was nothing like aggression and everything like purpose. The sound of it, the impact, the man's cry, the crunch of bone, was brutal in the quiet courtyard. Maya was already down. She didn't know exactly when, somewhere in the second exchange, when he'd swung with his other hand and caught her across the ribs, and then something lower, something that was different from the first cut, sharper, internal, the kind of hit that tells your body a different story. She was on the concrete with her back against the bench leg, and she could see the steam of her own breath, and she was aware, clinically, the way her medic training kept her aware even when her body was trying to pull the emergency brake, that she was bleeding from more than one place. Dax was still working. The man was down, screaming, his arm bent wrong. She tried to get up, got halfway. Didn't make it. The courtyard door burst open. Dominic, then 2 security guards, then chaos. She heard voices but couldn't parse them into individual words. She was focused on keeping pressure on the worst of it, her left hand pressed flat against her abdomen, and on keeping her breathing slow. Slow breathing, small breaths. Don't panic the oxygen out of yourself. You've been worse than this, some calibrated part of her said. She wasn't entirely sure that was true. Dax came to her. She didn't call him. He just came and put his body against her side with the same deliberate weight that she imagined he'd learned to put against Warren Okafor's leg on bad nights, and she pressed her free hand into his fur because he was warm and real and something to anchor to. The last clear thing she saw, before Dominic's face was above her and his voice was finally resolving into words, was Dr. Foyle standing in the courtyard doorway. The man who had sent her out here, who had handed her a lead and told her to deal with it like she was a problem-sorting function rather than a person, standing there with his face completely open, stripped of the authority and the condescension and the institutional armor, looking at her with an expression she had never seen him wear before. Something adjacent to horror. Something that might have been, underneath all of it, the first real moment of recognition he had ever offered her. She thought, too late for that. Then the cold came up fast, and then the darkness, and then nothing at all. Inside Greystone's trauma bay, the team that assembled around Maya Reeves moved with the specific, terrible speed of medical professionals trying to outrun what they already suspected. 3 wounds. The abdominal one was the worst. Deep, trajectory wrong. The kind that required a surgeon and an OR and time, and they were already behind on time. Dominic Yates stood outside Bay 3 with blood on his scrubs that was not his own and his hands pressed together at his mouth, and he thought about all the times in the past 6 months that Maya had walked him through a procedure or talked him off a ledge after a bad case or handed him coffee without being asked because she had noticed, somehow, in the middle of a 12-hour shift that he was running on empty. He had never once asked her where she'd learned to be like that. Foyle was on the phone. Nobody was certain who he was calling. His voice was lower than usual. Upstairs in the ICU, where Warren Okafor had been stabilized and was drifting in and out of something between sleep and awareness, Dax lay on the floor beside the bed where a nurse had quietly allowed him to be, against about 4 different policies that she had decided, for tonight, did not apply. Warren's hand rested on the dog's head. Neither of them knew yet what had happened in the courtyard. And in the trauma bay, the team worked, and the monitors spoke in numbers. And somewhere in Pelham Falls on this frozen January night, a man with a shattered arm and Rex's bite marks was being loaded into a police cruiser, still not understanding, not yet, that the woman he'd left bleeding on hospital concrete was not the soft target he'd taken her for. He had made a significant miscalculation. The results of that miscalculation were only beginning. The man's name was Curtis Brawl, and he had made, in the span of approximately 90 seconds in a hospital courtyard, enough mistakes to occupy the rest of his life. The arresting officers found him exactly where Dax had left him, on the wet concrete near the chain-link gate, his right arm folded at an angle that arms are not designed to fold, his face a mask of pain and something close to disbelief. He had not expected the dog. He had especially not expected the woman. People like Curtis Brawl built their lives on a particular assessment of what other people were capable of, and it was an assessment that had served him adequately until tonight, when it had failed him completely. Detective Lana Marsh arrived at Greystone Regional at 11:40 p.m., 40 minutes after the call came in, having driven from the opposite end of Pelham Falls in weather that had no business being driven in. She was 43, compact, with the kind of face that stayed neutral as a professional practice rather than a personality trait. Her partner, a younger detective named Rollins, was already on scene, talking to the security guards who'd reached the courtyard first. She found Rollins in the ambulance bay, notebook out, expression somewhere between efficient and troubled. "How bad?" she asked. "The nurse is in surgery, 3 wounds, one of them serious." He paused. "She's the one who called it in, actually, before she lost consciousness. She used her radio." Marsh took that in. A woman with 3 stab wounds had found the presence of mind to key her radio before she went down. "What about the suspect?" "Brawl Curtis James, 37, 2 priors. Aggravated assault, 1 domestic. Got out of Jessup 11 months ago." Rollins turned a page. "Here's the thing. He didn't come here for the nurse. He came for the dog. Marsh looked at him. The patient who came in tonight, Warren Okafor, he's got a military K9 registered to him, Belgian Malinois named Dax. Brawl followed the ambulance. He followed an ambulance to a hospital to get to a dog. Far as we can piece together, yes. She stood there for a moment in the cold blast of the ambulance bay and worked through what she was being told. A man with a history of violence had tracked a registered military service animal to a hospital, gone through a side gate with a fixed blade, and been engaged by a nurse who was alone in the courtyard with the dog, and nothing else. What's the connection between Brawl and Okafor? Rollins shook his head. Working on it. Okafor's not in any condition to talk. The ER staff don't know anything about him except what came in on the paramedic handoff. He paused again, with the slight hesitation of someone not sure how to categorize the next piece of information. There was one thing. When they were bringing Brawl in, he kept saying the same thing. He took something that wasn't his. He took something that wasn't his. Wouldn't say what. Marsh wrote it down. Inside the hospital, the surgical team had been working on Maya Reeves for 47 minutes. The abdominal wound was the one that commanded everyone's full attention. The blade had entered at an angle that suggested the attacker had been moving when he delivered it. Not a clean thrust, but a dragging cut, which was in some ways worse, because it meant more contact with more things that needed to stay intact. The trauma surgeon, a quiet woman named Dr. Adeyes Pell, who was known on the night shift for never once raising her voice regardless of circumstances, worked with a concentration so complete that the room around her existed only as a series of functional inputs: instrument, suction, lighting angle, vital signs. The vitals were not cooperating. Pressure's dropping, the anesthesiologist said. I see it. Dr. Pell didn't look up. Give me 2 minutes. The 2 minutes stretched. In the waiting area adjacent to the surgical suite, Dominic Yates sat in a plastic chair with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor, and he did the thing that people in medical settings learn to do when the uncertainty is too large to hold. He made himself very small inside it. He focused on the texture of the linoleum. He counted the scuff marks. He did not let himself think about the monitor numbers he'd seen right before the OR doors closed. He had known Maya Reeves for almost 2.5 years. He had met her on his third shift when he'd made an error in a medication calculation that he'd caught himself before it caused harm. But barely. Barely. And he had been standing in the medication room at 2 a.m. shaking slightly, not from fear of getting caught, but from the raw vertigo of almost but not quite, when Maya had come in for something else and stopped and looked at him and said, without preamble, "Write it down. What you almost did. What you caught. Then keep going." He'd looked at her. "Isn't that the kind of thing I should report?" "You caught it yourself. Yes, report it, and write down how you caught it, because that's the part that actually matters." She'd taken a small bottle from the shelf she needed. "Near misses are how you learn where the real edges are. Don't throw it away." She had not made it into a speech. She'd just said it, the way she said most things, straight and without decoration. And then she'd left, and Dominic had taken out his phone and written it down, and it had, in fact, mattered, more than once in the years since. He pressed his palms against his thighs and waited. Across the hospital, in the ICU on the 3rd floor, Warren Okafor was awake. He had been awake, on and off, for about an hour, surfacing from the fog of the sedative they'd given him during the initial stabilization and sinking back and surfacing again, each time a little more present, a little more aware of the room and the tubes and the particular quality of stillness that hospitals produced in the middle of the night. His blood pressure was better than it had been. His breathing was still monitored, but no longer assisted. The internal situation was serious, but the on-call internist had told him with careful optimism, manageable. Dax was asleep on the floor beside him. This was a violation of approximately 4 hospital policies that the night nurse, a young woman named Tara, who had looked at the dog and looked at the patient and made a quiet, individual decision, had chosen to set aside. She had also, at some point in the past hour, brought a blanket from somewhere and folded it into a pad for Dax to lie on, which was either compassion or the behavior of someone who recognized that the dog would be sleeping on this floor regardless and had decided to make peace with it. Warren looked at the ceiling. He was aware that something had happened. He'd heard voices in the hallway earlier, an urgency that leaked through the institutional quiet in a way that told him it wasn't routine. He had asked Tara, when she came to check his vitals, whether everything was all right. She had hesitated for a half-second too long. "There was an incident earlier," she'd said carefully. "In the courtyard. But it's being handled. You don't need to worry about that right now." Warren Okafor had spent the better part of 30 years in situations where the phrase "it's being handled" meant something had gone badly wrong and the person saying it was trying to decide how much you needed to know. He recognized the phrase the way you recognized a particular smell, instantly in the body before the mind. He said, "What kind of incident?" Tara had arranged his IV line unnecessarily. "I'm not really supposed to—" "Tara." His voice was quiet, but it had a quality in it that she couldn't locate exactly. Not authority, exactly. Something else. Something that made you want to give him the information because not giving it suddenly felt worse than giving it. Was it about the dog? She'd looked at Dax, then back at Warren, and something in that sequence of glances told Warren everything the words hadn't yet. He closed his eyes. His jaw tightened. He said nothing more. But he lay there in the dark with his hand on Dax's back, and something moved behind his face that was not peaceful and would not be peaceful for a while. The surgery on Maya Reeves took 3 hours and 14 minutes. It was not until the last 40 of those minutes that Dr. Pell's shoulders released even a fraction of their held tension. A small shift, almost invisible, that the scrub nurses had learned to read across years of working with her as a sign that the worst of it was probably behind them. The abdominal repair had been the long part, the careful part, the part where every minute of attention mattered, and there were several in which the numbers on the monitors had moved in directions that made the room very quiet. She hadn't lost her, but it had been close in a way that Dr. Pell didn't usually allow herself to characterize in those terms until she was sitting in her car after a shift. Close was a word for later. During, you just worked. At 2:17 a.m., Maya was moved to the ICU on the same floor as Warren Okafor, 2 rooms down. She was intubated, sedated, monitored in the comprehensive and slightly claustrophobic way of someone whose body had survived something serious and was now being watched extremely carefully for signs of what came next. Foyle was not in the hospital at this point. He had left sometime around midnight, or, more precisely, he had been present in the building without being meaningfully present in any of the rooms where Maya's condition was being managed. And then he had signed out and gone home, and nobody had asked him about it directly, but the quality of his absence was noted by several people who were still there. Dominic had not gone home. He sat in the ICU family waiting room, a room meant for family members, which he was not, but which the night charge nurse, Adela, had not made any comment about. And he had at some point been joined by 2 other nurses from the night shift, Priya and Marcus, who had both stayed past the end of their shifts for reasons none of them articulated. They sat mostly in silence. Priya had brought coffee from the floor machine, which was terrible, and they drank it anyway. Marcus had his phone out but wasn't looking at the screen. Dominic was looking at his hands. Around 2:30 a.m., Adela came in. "She's stable," Adela said. "For now, Dr. Pell says she'll know more by morning." Nobody said the obvious thing, which was that stable for now was a category with a lot of room in it. "Was there anyone to call?" Priya asked quietly. "Family?" Adela paused. "Her emergency contact is a woman named Sandra Reeves, her mother. We reached her. She's driving from Pittsburgh." She hesitated, which meant there was more. There was also a number in her file listed as, it just said unit contact. We tried it. Marcus looked up from his phone. "And?" It rang through to an automated service, the kind that takes a message. Adela's expression was neutral in a way that meant she'd registered something about the nature of that automated service and had filed it under "not my question to ask." "We left one." The room was quiet again. What none of them knew, what would not become clear until the next morning, was that the message left on that number had not simply sat in an automated queue and waited. These things rarely worked that way, when the name attached to the message was one that had accumulated, over 7 years of service, a certain kind of weight. Curtis Brawl was processed at Pelham Falls Central Booking at 1 a.m., which meant photographs and fingerprints and the administrative machinery of a system gearing up to hold him. His arm had been splinted at the scene by paramedics who had done the minimum necessary without much warmth, functional care, which was what the job required. He would need surgery on it. That would happen in custody. He had stopped talking by the time Detective Marsh came to the interview room. She sat across from him in the flat light of the room and put a folder on the table and looked at him for a moment without opening it. Marsh had a way of sitting that managed to convey no particular feeling about the person across from her, which was useful in interview rooms and also, she had been told, occasionally unsettling. "Mr. Brawl," she said, "do you want to tell me about Warren Okafor?" "Nothing." "Or about the dog?" His eyes moved, just slightly. She caught it. "You went to the hospital tonight with a knife," she said. "Not for the man, as far as we can tell. For the animal. Help me understand that." Brawl looked at the wall beside her. "I want a lawyer." "That's your right." She stood, collected the folder. "I'm going to tell you one thing before I go, just so you have the full picture. The nurse who was in that courtyard tonight, she's in the ICU. 3 wounds. The charge that was going to be assault just became something significantly larger." He said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw moved. "Whatever you thought this was going to be tonight," Marsh said, "it isn't that anymore." She left him there with his splinted arm and his silence, and she went back to her desk to start pulling the thread of Warren Okafor's history, which turned out to be, at 2 a.m. on a January night in Pelham Falls, like pulling a thread that connected to something larger and considerably more serious than a man with a K9 coming into an ER. Okafor, Warren James, age 53. Decorated service record. She had to go through 2 separate systems to see how decorated, because some of the records were flagged in ways that made her pause. Former contractor status after discharge, affiliated with a firm called Meridian Group that her search returned almost nothing on, which was itself a kind of information. The dog, Dax, was registered with a federal designation as a retired military working animal. The registration was current. What connected Warren Okafor to Curtis Brawl was not immediately visible in any database Marsh had access to, which meant it was the kind of connection that existed in the actual world rather than in systems, a specific grievance, a specific history, something one man believed the other man had taken from him. He took something that wasn't his. She wrote a note and flagged it for morning, when she could make calls she couldn't make at 3 a.m. By 6 a.m., a thin gray light was beginning to press against the windows of Greystone Regional Medical Center, and the hospital was in that particular transitional state of early morning, night staff running long, day staff beginning to arrive, the building neither fully one shift nor fully another. The ICU was quieter than the floors below. The monitors were steady. Maya Reeves had made it through the night, which was not nothing. Warren Okafor had also made it through the night, though made it through was a relative term for a man who had lain awake for most of it, working through something in his head that he wasn't sharing with the night nurse who came to check his vitals every hour. At 6:20 a.m., Tara, who had stayed nearly 4 hours past the end of her shift, which she would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked, came in to do Warren's morning check and found him sitting upright. "You should rest," she said. "I've been resting." His voice was rougher than it had been. "The nurse, the one from last night, tell me." Tara took a breath. She'd been thinking about this moment since 3 a.m., when she'd made the decision that he would eventually ask and that she would tell him the truth. Some patients needed to be protected from information. Warren Okafor was not that kind of patient. "Her name is Maya Reeves," she said. "She's a nurse here, nights. She was in the courtyard with Dax when the man came through the gate." She paused. "She's in the ICU, 2 doors down." Warren's face did the thing it had done last night. That movement behind the surface, controlled and private and not peaceful. "How bad?" "She's stable. It was touch and go during surgery." Tara looked at him directly. She protected him. The man went for Dax and she put herself between them. The silence after that lasted long enough to have weight. "Did they get him?" Warren said. "Yes, he was arrested on scene." "Who is he, What?" "I don't know. The police haven't said." Warren looked at the wall across from his bed. Dax had woken up at the sound of voices and was sitting now, watching Warren's face with the same monitoring attention he brought to everything. Warren looked at the dog for a moment. "She saved his life," Warren said. It wasn't a question. "I think she probably did. Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I need my phone." The phone had come in with his personal effects. Tara found it in the bedside cabinet, handed it over, and watched him unlock it with the careful deliberation of a man who was in pain and managing it by keeping his movements precise. He found a contact, looked at it for a moment, and dialed. It rang 3 times. "It's Warren." He paused. "I'm at Greystone Regional in Pelham Falls. I'm all right, but there's something you need to know." Another pause, and the quality of his voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but differently weighted. "There's a nurse here. Her name is Maya Reeves. She was Army medic, 2 tours. She took 3 stab wounds last night, protecting Dax from an attacker while I was in surgery." He listened. "No, I don't know her. I want to know who she is." He hung up. Tara looked at him. She had heard the conversation and understood approximately half of what she had heard. "Who were you calling?" she asked, before she'd fully decided whether that was her question to ask. Warren handed the phone back. "Someone who can find out things," he said, in a way that closed that particular door without slamming it. The day shift at Greystone arrived to a hospital that felt different in a way that was hard to locate precisely. It was in the way people talked to each other at the nursing station, with a kind of lowered voice that wasn't about privacy exactly, but about register, about the specific frequency that people unconsciously adopt when something serious has happened in a place they work. It was in the way Dominic moved through the handoff, giving the incoming nurses the overnight summary with a flatness that the day-charged nurse, an experienced woman named Patricia, recognized and filed away. The story moved through the hospital the way stories do in enclosed professional environments, in pieces, some accurate and some not, assembled and reassembled by people who had different relationships to the event and different things they needed from it. What was consistent across all versions was this. Maya Reeves had been attacked in the South Courtyard, and it had been bad, and she was in the ICU. What most people did not know, and what would have changed the texture of the conversation significantly if they had, was what was happening outside the hospital. At 8:14 a.m., 2 men arrived in the Greystone Regional Visitor parking lot in a gray pickup truck. They didn't come inside immediately. They sat in the truck for a few minutes, and then one of them made a phone call, and then they got out. They were both in their 40s, nondescript in the way of people who'd spent time professionally not standing out. They went to the visitor desk and asked about Maya Reeves. The desk attendant, following protocol, told them only that she was a patient and that they would need to speak with nursing staff for any further information. One of the men, the shorter one, with a beard going gray at the jaw, nodded and said thank you and didn't make a scene about it, which was not what you'd expect from someone who'd driven through the night to get here. They sat in the lobby. A second vehicle arrived at 8:40. By 10 a.m., there were 11 people in and around the lobby of Greystone Regional Medical Center who had no visible connection to each other and every connection to each other that mattered. Some sat, some stood near the windows. None of them raised their voices or made demands or approached hospital staff with the aggressive impatience that a waiting room usually generated in people who had reason to be urgent. They just waited. Patricia noticed them around 10:15 when she was coming back from a brief walk to the ground floor. She stood in the lobby for a moment and looked at them. This collection of quietly alert people, most of them men, ranging from late 30s to early 60s, some with the particular physical signature of former military that she'd been around enough to recognize, all of them focused on the building in a way that was attentive rather than threatening. She went back upstairs and said nothing, but she noticed. What she didn't know, and wouldn't until later, was that the phone call Warren Okafor had made at 6:30 in the morning had been the first in a chain of calls that moved through networks built on a specific kind of trust, the kind that doesn't require explanation, that operates on the currency of one of ours is down and asks no further questions before responding. She didn't know that 6 of the people in the lobby had driven more than 2 hours to be there, or that one of them had gotten on a flight from Atlanta at 5 a.m., or that the process of finding out who Maya Reeves was had taken Warren's contact approximately 45 minutes and had produced, In that time, a document that was not a document anyone outside of certain specific contexts would ever see. 7 years of service, 2 deployments, 1 to eastern Afghanistan, 1 to a location listed only by a code designation. A series of commendations that were notable not for their number, but for the specificity of their language, which was the language of recommendations written by people who needed to describe something they couldn't describe in full. A medical discharge on grounds that were also partially redacted, though not in a way that obscured what they pointed toward. Someone who had come back from places that leave marks, had put herself back together with whatever was available, and had quietly rebuilt her life in a second-floor ER in a mid-sized Maryland city where most of her colleagues thought she was just a nurse who cared too much. Warren had read the document in his ICU bed with his morning medications making his head feel like it was wrapped in gauze, and he had sat with it for a while, and then he had called back and said only, "She shouldn't be in there alone." The response from the other end had been, "She won't be." Also, at 11:30 a.m., Maya Reeves's mother arrived. Sandra Reeves was 61, gray-haired, wearing a winter coat that looked like it had been grabbed in a hurry. It was her daughter's coat, the one hanging by the door because she hadn't thought clearly in the first 10 minutes after the phone call. She had driven 5 hours from Pittsburgh on 3 hours of sleep, and she looked like it. She looked like a woman who had received in the middle of the night the phone call that all mothers of soldiers already know is always possible and spend a lifetime quietly preparing for and are never remotely prepared for when it comes. Dominic found her at the ICU desk and walked her to Maya's room. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The room was dim, the blinds half closed against the winter glare. Maya was in the bed with the tubes and the monitors, and she was pale in a way that Sandra had seen her pale before. Once, when she was 8 years old and very sick with something they'd spent 3 weeks not being able to diagnose, and once on a video call from overseas, when Maya had appeared on the screen looking thin and tired and had said, "I'm fine." Mom in exactly the tone that meant she was not entirely fine. Sandra sat in the chair beside the bed and took Maya's hand, careful of the IV line. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the room didn't already contain. Dominic left them alone and went back to the floor, where he had a shift to finish, and he told himself to focus on that and managed it approximately 40% of the time. At 12:15 p.m., Detective Marsh came back to Greystone with a warrant and a question. The question was about Warren Okafor, not about his medical condition, which was the hospital's business, about his connection to Curtis Brawl, which was now hers. She had spent the morning making calls that her 3 a.m. self had flagged, and what those calls had produced was not quite a clear answer, but the outline of one. Brawl had, 8 months ago, been employed by a private security firm that had contracted briefly with an entity connected to Meridian Group, Warren Okafor's former employer. The contract had ended badly, under circumstances that were disputed, and Brawl had not been quiet about holding Warren Okafor personally responsible for what he felt was a professional destruction. He took something that wasn't his. What Warren had taken, in Brawl's accounting, was a reference that had been refused, a recommendation that had gone negative, a characterization that had cost Brawl a subsequent contract, and then another one, and then a third one, until Brawl had run out of the kind of second chances that men like him usually found available, and the grievance had fermented into something harder and less rational. The dog had been a proxy, a way to take something or to damage something that mattered, when the man himself was harder to get to. Marsh had seen this shape before. Grievance that calcified, proxy violence when the target was protected, collateral damage to the thing or person the target loved as a substitute for the target himself. The collateral damage in this case was currently in the ICU. She found Warren Okafor alert and sitting up, Dax beside the bed. "Mr. Okafor," she said, showing her badge. "Detective Marsh, Pelham Falls PD. I need to ask you some questions about Curtis Brawl." Warren looked at her with the measured alertness of a man who had interacted with law enforcement enough times to know exactly what he was and wasn't required to share. "Ask," he said. She sat. She asked. He answered, carefully, with the precision of someone who had spent years in environments where precise communication was essential and careless communication was dangerous. He gave her what she needed to build the legal architecture of last night's events. He did not give her more than she needed, but what he gave her was enough, and she could see him understanding as the conversation progressed that it was enough, that Brawl's situation was not a gray area and was not going to become one. Near the end of the interview, Warren said, "The nurse, Maya Reeves, she's going to recover?" "Her doctors are optimistic," Marsh said. "I want to know about her charges, anything that gets filed, any complications." Marsh looked at him. "Are you expecting complications?" Warren met her eyes. "I'm expecting her to be treated with every consideration her situation deserves," he said, which was not quite an answer and was also, she sensed, precisely as much of an answer as he intended to give. She collected her notes. She was almost to the door when he said, without particular inflection, "The people downstairs, in the lobby." She turned. "They're not a problem," he said. "They're just making sure." Marsh looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I noticed them." She left. She walked to the elevator and stood in it on the way down, and she thought about what making sure meant, and what kind of network produced 11 people in a lobby by 10 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in winter, and what kind of person Maya Reeves was that this network existed on her behalf even before she was conscious to know it. The elevator opened on the ground floor. The lobby was quieter than it had been. 4 of the original 11 had moved outside, to the small paved area near the main entrance, where they stood in the cold without apparent complaint. The remaining 7 were distributed through the waiting area in the patient arrangement of people who had nowhere else to be and no intention of leaving. None of them looked at Marsh as she walked through, but she had the distinct and not entirely comfortable feeling of being registered, calmly, without hostility, the way trained observation registers things, cataloging and moving on. She pushed through the main doors into the January air and stood on the steps for a moment. Her phone buzzed. It was Rollins. "The hospital's legal team just called," he said. "They want to know about the status of the investigation." "Tell them it's active." "They're asking specifically about the liability angle, whether the nurse was acting." "Tell them it's active," Marsh repeated, sharper this time. "And tell them that anything they want to say publicly about what happened in that courtyard needs to be run through the DA's office first, because we have an ongoing investigation, and I won't have anyone muddying the evidentiary record before we're through." A pause. Then Rollins said, "They're not going to like that." "No," Marsh agreed. "They're not." She hung up and walked to her car, and behind her the glass doors of Greystone Regional Medical Center reflected the flat winter sky, and inside the hospital a woman lay in a bed 2 floors up, breathing steadily now, while her mother held her hand, while a man she had never met had made one phone call that had brought 11 people to a lobby to stand watch, while a detective was driving back to a precinct to build a case, while somewhere on the other side of Pelham Falls, a man with a shattered arm and a federal charge was sitting in a jail cell trying to understand how the night had become this. At 2:47 p.m., Maya Reeves's blood pressure dropped. Not catastrophically. Not the way it had dropped during surgery, which had been a different animal entirely, but enough that the monitor alarmed and the ICU nurse on duty responded immediately, and Dr. Pell was paged and arrived within 4 minutes. And for approximately 20 minutes, the room was occupied by the focused and quiet intensity of medical people doing their jobs at a level that didn't leave room for anything else. Sandra Reeves was asked to wait outside. She stood in the hallway with her hands together, and she did not cry, because she was the kind of woman who had learned to hold herself together in hallways while people with medical expertise did things on the other side of doors. And she had learned this because her daughter had made choices that led to hallways like this, and Sandra had, over the years, become competent at surviving them, which was not the same thing as making peace with them. The 20 minutes passed. Dr. Pell came out. Her expression was controlled in the way of someone managing information rather than hiding it. "We've stabilized her," she said. The drop was... She paused, choosing words. "Her body is dealing with a significant amount. We're adjusting the treatment and watching closely." Sandra looked at her. "That's not the same as she's fine." Dr. Pell held her gaze. "No, it's not." Sandra nodded. She went back to the chair she'd been sitting in for the past 6 hours, and she sat in it, and she picked up her daughter's hand again, and she looked at Maya's face, at the exhausted, battered, stubbornly breathing face of a woman who had spent her entire adult life putting herself between things and the people or animals or ideas that needed protecting. And Sandra Reeves said quietly and without drama, to no one in particular. "Come on." Down the hall, Warren Okafor heard the alarm from his room. He heard the footsteps. He heard the quality of the hallway change and then return to quiet. He lay there and looked at the ceiling, and Dax put his head on the edge of the bed and Warren pressed a hand against the dog's skull. He had been trying, for the past several hours, to get information about Maya Reeves from people who were professionally unable to give him information about a patient who was not his family. He had not succeeded. But he had learned enough. From the sounds of the hallway, from the expressions on faces that passed his doorway, to understand that whatever was happening 2 rooms down was not simple. He dialed. "It's Warren." His voice was flat and quiet. "I need you to find out about her background, not general, specific, what she went through, what she came back with." He listened. "Because I owe someone a debt I'm not capable of paying anonymously, and I don't want to get it wrong." He hung up. He lay there. The afternoon light through the window was already going gray. 2 rooms down, the monitor held steady. For now. But somewhere in the administrative offices of Greystone Regional Medical Center, a conversation was taking place that Maya Reeves, unconscious and unaware, would not have the chance to defend herself against. A conversation about liability and protocol and the legal exposure of the hospital regarding an employee who had engaged a knife-wielding attacker on hospital property without authorization from anyone, without following established safety protocols, and without apparent regard for what the hospital's insurer was going to say about any of it. The word unauthorized appeared 4 times. The phrase potential disciplinary action appeared once, near the end, spoken quietly by a man named Harwell, who was the hospital's VP of Risk Management, to a room of 3 other administrators, one of whom had the decency to look uncomfortable. None of the 4 men in that room had been in the courtyard last night. None of them had seen the gate open. None of them had watched a woman take 5 wounds without going down until the 3rd one, holding a military dog's lead in one hand and nothing else, buying time with her body because it was the only currency she had. But the paperwork was real, and Harwell was already composing the memo in his head. Outside, the gray Pelham Falls afternoon had turned toward evening, and the people in the lobby had been joined by 6 more, and nobody at the hospital's front desk had asked them to leave. The memo landed in Patricia's inbox at 6:47 a.m. the following morning. She read it twice, standing at the nursing station with her coat still on, before she set her phone face down on the desk and stood there for a moment looking at nothing. The subject line was Incident Review, M. Reeves, Preliminary Administrative Assessment. The body of it was 14 sentences of careful institutional language that amounted, when you stripped away the hedge words and the passive constructions, to this: Maya Reeves had violated safety protocol by engaging an armed individual rather than retreating and alerting security, and the hospital was initiating a formal review of her conduct that could result in disciplinary action up to and including termination of employment. The memo had been sent at 6:31 a.m. Maya Reeves had been in the ICU for 31 hours. She had not yet regained consciousness. Patricia picked up her phone, read the memo a 3rd time, and then walked directly to the office of Dr. Foyle, who arrived on the day shift at 7 a.m. and was currently standing at his desk reading his own copy of the same email with an expression that told her he had known this was coming. She pushed the door open without knocking. "You're aware of this," she said. Foyle looked up. "It's a standard administrative. She was in that courtyard because you told her to go." Patricia's voice was level, which was more frightening than if she'd shouted. "You handed her that dog's lead and told her to deal with it. Those are your words. 3 people heard them." Something moved across Foyle's face. Not guilt exactly, but the uncomfortable proximity of it. "My instruction was to relocate the animal, not to engage." She didn't choose to engage. Someone came through the gate with a knife. Patricia set her phone on his desk with the memo visible. "So before you put your name on anything that says she acted outside protocol, I want you to understand exactly how many people in this building know what your role was that night." Foyle looked at the phone, then at her. "That's not a threat I'm going to respond well to." "It's not a threat," she said. "It's the situation." She left his office and closed the door with exactly enough force to be heard. By 8 a.m., the memo had spread through the hospital's medical staff, the way things spread in buildings where people shared walls and schedules, and an acute sensitivity to institutional injustice, fast, person to person, with each retelling adding a degree more outrage because each retelling was accurate and the accuracy was the problem. Dominic saw it forwarded in a group chat he was barely awake enough to read, sitting in his car in the parking structure before his shift, and he sat there for 90 seconds not moving and then got out and went inside. At 9:15, Detective Marsh arrived at the hospital for the third time in 2 days. She had not come for the memo, which she didn't know about yet. She had come because Curtis Brawl's public defender had contacted the DA's office at 7 a.m. with an argument that Marsh had seen coming and had hoped, without much conviction, would not materialize this quickly. The defender was arguing that Brawl's arm injury, inflicted by Dax, constituted excessive response, and that the involvement of a trained military animal changed the legal character of the encounter in ways that complicated the assault charge against his client. It was not a strong argument. Marsh knew that, but it didn't need to be strong to create delay. And delay was expensive when you had a victim in the ICU and a case that needed to close cleanly before anyone decided to get creative with the facts. She went up to the third floor. She found Warren Okafor dressed, sitting in the chair beside his bed rather than in it, which suggested either medical clearance she hadn't heard about or the specific stubbornness of a man who had decided that lying down was no longer an option. "Mr. Okafor," she said, "how are you feeling?" "Like I'm done being a patient." He looked at her directly. "Brawl's lawyer is moving." She kept her face neutral. "How do you know that?" "Because I know how this works." He set his hands on his knees. "What do you need from me?" "I need a formal statement, detailed, on record, about your history with Brawl. Dates, specifics, the recommendation refusal, all of it. Your personal account creates the motive, and motive closes the argument his defender is trying to open." Warren was quiet for a moment. Giving a detailed formal statement about his professional history was not a cost-free action for a man whose professional history included chapters that were not public. She could see him calculating this. "Will it protect her?" he said. Marsh didn't pretend not to understand what he was asking. "It's a significant piece of the case, yes." He nodded once. "Then let's do it." They were 40 minutes into the statement, Warren speaking with the careful specificity of someone who had spent years learning to be precise, when the door opened and a nurse Marsh didn't recognize put her head in and looked at Warren. "Mr. Okafor, the doctors want to do your morning assessment." "After this?" The nurse looked uncertain. Dr. Pell was, "After the this," Warren repeated, in a way that settled it. The door closed. Warren kept going. When they finished, Marsh reviewed her notes, collected her recorder, and stood. "One more thing," she said. "The people downstairs, how many now?" Warren's expression didn't change. "I haven't been downstairs." "I counted 23 this morning." Something almost like satisfaction moved through his face and disappeared. "Then there are 23, he said. Marsh walked out into the hallway and nearly ran into Patricia, who was moving with the purposeful velocity of someone with somewhere to be and a specific agenda for when she got there. They looked at each other briefly, strangers who had both been awake too long for different reasons. "Is there something happening I should know about?" Marsh asked, because the quality of the hallway had changed since yesterday, and she was a detective, and that was her job. Patricia looked at her. "The hospital is trying to build a disciplinary case against a nurse who is currently unconscious in the ICU. Marsh absorbed this. "On what grounds?" "Unauthorized engagement with a hostile individual." Patricia said it flatly. She should have retreated. The two women looked at each other for a moment in the hallway of a hospital at 10 a.m. on a Thursday, and something passed between them that was not a plan and was also not nothing. "I see," Marsh said. She went to find the risk management office. Harwell was behind his desk when she came in, and she showed her badge and sat without being invited. And she said, "I understand the hospital is initiating disciplinary proceedings against Maya Reeves." Harwell arranged his expression into the practiced reasonableness of someone who managed situations for a living. "It's a standard post-incident review, completely routine." "I want to make sure you understand the evidentiary implications," Marsh said. "If the hospital takes formal disciplinary action based on Ms. Reeves's conduct in that courtyard, It creates a documented institutional position about what happened. That position will be discoverable. It will be referenced in the criminal trial. She paused. If the hospital argues, in writing, that Ms. Reeves acted outside appropriate bounds, the defense will use that document to argue that the animal's response was disproportionate, to argue that the situation was ambiguous. She looked at him steadily. I'm sure your legal team has walked you through this. From the look on Harwell's face, they had not walked him through this. I'd suggest, Marsh said, putting the review on hold until after the criminal proceedings conclude. At that point, you'll have a court's finding on record about what actually happened in that courtyard, and your review can proceed from established fact rather than administrative interpretation. She stood. Or don't, she said, but I wanted to have this conversation before anything was filed. She left. She didn't know if it would hold. In her experience, institutions moved on institutional logic, and institutional logic was only loosely connected to other kinds of logic, but she had put a wedge in it, and a wedge was sometimes enough. At 11:50 a.m., Dr. Pell was doing her rounds when she stopped outside Maya's room and checked the morning's chart updates, and she found a set of numbers that made her stop. Not dramatically. She was not a dramatic person. She stood there with the chart and re-examined the overnight data, and then she went inside. Sandra Reeves looked up from the chair. The woman had barely left the room. She'd slept in the chair, which Dr. Pell knew because the night nurse had mentioned it. Her numbers are shifting, Dr. Pell said carefully. Sandra's face tightened. Shifting which direction? Dr. Pell looked at the monitors, then at Sandra. The inflammation markers are down from this morning. Her pressure has held stable for 6 hours. She paused, with the particular caution of a physician who had been burned before by premature optimism. It's early, but it's the direction we want. Sandra looked at her daughter's face. She's not going to make it easy, Sandra said quietly. She never does. Doctor. Pell looked at the patient in the bed. The bruised, tubed, steadily breathing woman who had, by every account available, spent the worst night of her medical career being the calmest person in a crisis. And she said, "No, I don't think she will." She updated the chart and moved on. At 1:30 p.m., Warren Okafor was formally discharged. He had argued his way out of a recommended 48 additional hours of monitoring with a thoroughness that left the discharging physician mildly defeated. He got dressed slowly because his body was still registering its objections to the previous 48 hours. And he sat on the edge of the bed while the nurse, not Tara, who had finally gone home, processed his paperwork. Dax stood beside him. He looked at the wall that separated his room from the hallway, beyond which, 2 doors down, was a woman he had never spoken to. He was thinking about the document his contact had sent him that morning, the fuller version, with the specificity he'd asked for. He had read the parts about Maya's second deployment twice. He had read, in the careful, euphemistic language of official reports, about the incident in the 14th month of that deployment that had ended her service, the details of which were partially classified, but the shape of which was clear enough. She had gone into a situation with inadequate support and brought 3 people out and left a part of herself behind that the Army had called a medical discharge, and that she had apparently never publicly called anything at all. He had been carrying a different kind of loss in his own chest for 5 years. He recognized its shape in other people now, the way the blind eventually learn to read rooms. He stood up. "Mr. Okafor," the nurse said, glancing up, "your discharge paperwork isn't quite—" "I'll be back," he said. He walked down the hall. He stopped outside room 14, Maya's room, and looked through the interior window. He could see the bed, the monitors, the woman in the chair who had to be the mother. He stood there for a moment. He could not explain what he owed a stranger, or why it felt specific rather than general. He was not given to sentiment, and he knew it, and he was aware that part of what he felt was not about her at all, but about the specific knowledge that someone had been hurt because of something connected to him, and that was a debt he had a long history of taking seriously. He went back to his room. He picked up his phone. The call he made was not to the contact he'd been using. It was to a number he used rarely, one belonging to a man named Garrett who worked for a law firm in Washington, D.C., that did not list itself publicly, and whose practice was limited to clients whose situations required a specific kind of legal expertise, the kind that understood how institutions protected themselves and knew exactly which angles to attack. I need you to look at something, Warren said without preamble. A hospital, an employee. They're building a case to discipline her for something she did to protect my dog while I was in surgery. He listened. Her name is Maya Reeves. A pause. Then Garrett said, "Send me everything you have." Warren sent it. He collected his discharge papers. He walked slowly and with some discomfort to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. He needed to see how many people were still there. The doors opened on the ground floor. He stopped. The lobby of Greystone Regional Medical Center was not the lobby he had been carried through 2 nights ago. The waiting area held, by his quick count, 31 people. Some he recognized, faces from years back. From context he didn't need to specify. Most he didn't. They were men and women both, ranging from young to well past middle age, with a variety of backgrounds visible in the way they held themselves and waited. They were not making noise. They were not demanding anything from the desk staff. They were simply present, in the specific and slightly terrible way that a large number of disciplined, patient people can be present, which is to say with the quality of something that has decided it is not leaving. A woman near the window, early 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, the unmistakable posture of someone with formal military history, looked up when Warren stepped out of the elevator. She crossed the lobby in 10 steps. "Warren!" "Sergeant DeLuca," he said. He hadn't seen her in 8 years. She looked at him, at his pallor, at the way he was favoring his left side. "You look terrible." "I'm told it's relative." He looked around the lobby. "How many more are coming?" 12, maybe 15, she paused. "Word got out. You know how that goes." He did know. He had been on the other end of it once, years ago, and had arrived at a hospital in a different state to stand in a lobby for a man who hadn't known he was there, and he had understood standing there what it meant to be the kind of person other people showed up for. He was beginning to understand something else now. "Has the hospital said anything?" he asked. DeLuca's jaw moved slightly. "The administrator came down about an hour ago, asked us to relocate to the street." She paused. "We're still here." Warren looked toward the administrative corridor. He was thinking about Harwell. He was thinking about the memo that Garrett had by now already read. He was thinking about a woman 2 floors up who did not know that any of this was happening and could not yet make any decisions about it. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was a text from Garrett, 4 words. "Call me, right now." Warren stepped away from DeLuca and dialed. "Talk," he said. "I pulled her employment file," Garrett said. "The hospital didn't just send the internal memo. They contacted the state nursing board this morning. Informal inquiry. Preemptive." A pause. "Warren, if the board opens a file on her, it doesn't matter what happens in the criminal case. She could lose her license." Warren stood very still in the lobby of Greystone Regional Medical Center, surrounded by 31 people who had come to stand watch, while upstairs a woman with 3 stab wounds was just beginning, to move in the right direction on a monitor, and the institution she had worked for was quietly, efficiently, and completely legally moving to take away the only thing she had rebuilt her life around. "How fast can you file an injunction?" Warren said. "Faster than they can act," Garrett said, "but I need authorization." "You have it." "Warren," Garrett's voice was careful. "This gets public, you understand that?" Warren looked at the elevator. He thought about the document he'd read that morning. He thought about a woman going through a gate with nothing but a dog's lead, making the calculation that any combat-trained person makes, that there are moments where you do not retreat, because retreat has a cost you are not willing to pay. "Good," he said. He hung up. And in the ICU on the 3rd floor, at the exact moment Warren Okafor made that decision, the monitor beside Maya Reeves's bed alarmed. Not the slow drift of the previous afternoon, but a sharp sudden change in pattern that brought the duty nurse running and triggered an overhead page that sent 2 physicians toward room 14 at a controlled sprint. Sandra Reeves was put into the hallway again. She pressed her back against the wall and she waited, and the door to her daughter's room stayed closed, and the sounds behind it were the sounds of people moving fast. The door to room 14 stayed closed for 11 minutes. Sandra Reeves counted them. She stood with her back against the wall and her arms crossed over her chest. Not in the defensive posture of someone shutting the world out, but in the practical posture of a woman holding herself together through sheer mechanical will. And she counted the minutes by the clock on the wall across the hallway because looking at the clock was something to do with her eyes that wasn't looking at the door. At minute 4, a second nurse went in. At minute 7, one came out moving quickly toward the supply room and returned with something Sandra couldn't identify. At minute 9, the voices behind the door, which she could hear but not parse, dropped from urgent to something more deliberate, which she interpreted as either good or the specific kind of controlled bad that preceded very difficult conversations. At minute 11, Dr. Pell came out. Sandra pushed off the wall. "She's still with us," Dr. Pell said immediately, because she had done this long enough to know that those were the first 4 words that mattered. What happened was an arrhythmia. Her heart went into an irregular pattern. We've corrected it. What caused it? Her body is under significant stress. We added a secondary medication to address an inflammation response we've been watching, and we think the combination triggered it. We're adjusting. Pell paused. This is a setback, Mrs. Reeves. I want to be honest with you about that, but it's a manageable one. Sandra looked at her. Is there a version of this where she doesn't make it? Dr. Pell held her gaze. She didn't look away, which Sandra appreciated. There's always that version. It's not the version I'm working toward. Sandra nodded once, tight. All right. She went back into the room. She sat down in the chair and she took her daughter's hand and she looked at Maya's face and she said nothing because there was nothing to say that Maya couldn't hear in the silence. Sandra had always believed, without having evidence for it, that the people in those beds heard more than the machines suggested. She didn't know if that was true, but she talked to Maya the way she'd talked to her through closed doors in adolescence, as if the information was landing somewhere, even if no acknowledgement came back. You've been in worse rooms than this, Sandra said quietly, and you came out of those. The monitor above the bed held steady. The afternoon light shifted. Downstairs, Warren Okafor was having a different kind of conversation. Garrett had called back 17 minutes after the first call with the specifics of the injunction, what it would cover, how quickly it could be filed, what the hospital's likely response would be, and on what timeline. Warren had listened and confirmed and ended the call, and then he had stood in the lobby for a moment doing a calculation he hadn't expected to be doing when he'd checked himself into an ER 2 nights ago. Going public meant a deposition. It meant his name in a filing accessible to anyone who knew how to search court records. It meant a degree of visibility that men in his former line of work maintained a professional allergy to. None of that was abstract. It had real costs, some of which he couldn't fully predict. He thought about the document, about a 14-month deployment and a partially redacted incident report, and a woman who had come back to the United States and gotten a nursing certification and taken a night shift in a mid-sized Maryland city, and then, on a Tuesday in January, done the only thing her training would allow her to do when she stood in a courtyard with a gate opening in front of her. He thought about the word unauthorized appearing in a memo written by a man who had never been to the places where authorization was a luxury you didn't always have. File it, he told Garrett, and put the phone away. He found a chair near the window and sat down, because his body was, despite his preference, still in the early stages of recovery, and standing for extended periods was something it was beginning to protest loudly. Sergeant DeLuca appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee from somewhere, he didn't ask where, and sat in the adjacent chair, and they were quiet for a moment in the way of people who had shared difficult situations before and didn't need to manufacture conversation to fill the space. Do you know her? DeLuca asked eventually. No. But you're doing all this. Warren wrapped his hands around the coffee. It was too hot, but he held it anyway because the warmth was useful. She protected Dax. She didn't have to. She had room to pull back and call it someone else's problem. A lot of people would have. She didn't. He looked at the elevator. That's not nothing. DeLuca was quiet for a moment, then, the people here, most of them got the call at 2 a.m. Nobody complained. Warren knew. He had not asked anyone to come. The mechanism was older than any individual request. It was what happened in these specific networks when the right words were transmitted, the same words that had moved people to hospital lobbies and courtrooms and congressional offices over the years, always quietly, always without press releases. always on the specific frequency of one of ours needs a witness. The fact that Maya Reeves did not yet know she was one of theirs did not, in anyone's accounting, change the mathematics of the situation. At 3:15 p.m., the injunction was filed in the District Court of Maryland. The filing named Greystone Regional Medical Center and its parent organization, Vantage Health Systems, as respondents. It cited the hospital's informal inquiry to the state nursing board as a retaliatory action taken against an employee who had been injured while responding to an emergency situation on hospital property, and it requested an immediate temporary restraining order preventing any further communication with the board pending a full hearing. Garrett's assistant hand-delivered a courtesy copy to the hospital's legal department at 3:30. The hospital's legal department spent approximately 20 minutes reading it and then placed an urgent call to the VP of Risk Management, who spent approximately 10 minutes reading it and then placed an equally urgent call to the hospital's CEO, a man named Philip Corden, who had been at a board lunch and was irritated at the interruption until he understood what he was being interrupted about, at which point he became a different kind of irritated. Corden arrived at the hospital at 4:20, moving with the purposeful discomfort of a man who has been caught doing something not illegal but deeply impolitic, and who is now in the business of calculating the exact extent of the damage. He was met in the lobby by something he had not been briefed on. He stopped inside the main doors and looked at the assembled group, 31 people by now spread between the lobby and the exterior plaza, calm and attentive and making no demands. A hospital security officer was nearby but clearly uncertain of his function here, since the gathered individuals were doing nothing actionable. They were simply present, with the specific gravity of people who had decided to be somewhere and were not going to be undecided about it. Corden found the security officer. "Who are these people?" he said, low. "We're not sure exactly, sir. They've been coming since this morning. We asked them to move outside once, but they declined. Declined. Politely," the officer said. Very politely. Corden looked at the group. His eyes landed on Warren Okafor, who was sitting near the window and looking directly back at him. Warren did not look hostile. He looked like a man who was comfortable waiting for whatever came next, and who had a significant amount of experience with that particular activity. Corden went to find Harwell. What happened in Harwell's office in the next 30 minutes was not, technically, a retreat. In the language of institutional communication, what happened was a recalibration of approach in light of new legal information. The inquiry to the nursing board was formally withdrawn via an email sent at 4:58 p.m. The internal disciplinary review memo was logged as suspended pending further review. These things happened with the quiet efficiency of organizations that have long practice in moving backward while appearing to move laterally. Harwell composed the withdrawal email himself. His hands, Patricia would later learn from someone who had been in the office, were not entirely steady when he typed it. Dr. Foyle learned about the injunction at 5 p.m. from the hospital's general counsel, who called him specifically because Foyle's name appeared in Garrett's filing. Not prominently, but there attached to a documented account of the instruction he had given Maya Reeves on the night of the incident. "Deal with the animal. Get it out of my ER." 3 witnesses. Logged in Dominic Yates's incident report, which Dominic had written at 2 a.m. because Maya, many months earlier, had told him to write things down. The near misses are how you learn where the real edges are. Foyle sat in his office after the call and looked at his desk. He was not a man who had spent much time in his career being confronted with the specific costs of his particular habits, because institutions generally protected men like him from that kind of reckoning for as long as the men were useful, and Foyle had been useful for a very long time. The filing was public record. That was the thing. Whatever Greystone's legal team managed to negotiate in terms of the injunction itself, the filing was searchable, and it named him, and it contained a documented account that was accurate. He picked up his phone and looked at it for a while without dialing. Then he put it down and sat there, in the particular silence of a man beginning to understand that the world has shifted under his feet without his permission. At 5:40 p.m., Marsh received a call from the DA's office. The argument Brawl's public defender had been constructing, that the dog's response constituted excessive force, that the ambiguity of the situation complicated the assault charge, had collapsed. It had collapsed for 3 reasons. Warren Okafor's formal statement, which established premeditation and specific targeting, security footage from the hospital's exterior cameras, which had captured Brawl at the perimeter fence at 9:45 p.m., more than an hour before the attack, scouting, and which the forensic team had located that afternoon, and a search of Brawl's apartment that had turned up a photograph of Dax, printed from a public records database, with a handwritten address that matched Okafor's last known residence. He had been tracking the dog for weeks. The premeditation changed the charge structure significantly. What had been a serious assault became, in the DA's framing, a coordinated targeted attack on a federal service animal and the individual who intervened to protect it. The federal designation of the dog added a charge that carried its own weight, and the weeks of documented surveillance, combined with the photograph and the address, made the spontaneous grievance narrative Brawl's defender had been attempting to construct functionally unusable. "It's a clean case," the DA's contact told Marsh. "The defender knows it. They're already asking about a plea." Marsh sat with the phone at her ear for a moment. "What kind of plea?" she said. "Early, full. They want sentencing consideration in exchange for a guilty plea on all counts, no trial." "What's the sentencing range we're talking about?" The number she was given was not small. She thanked the contact, hung up, and sat for a moment at her desk. She thought about the courtyard. She thought about a woman who had weighed the situation in approximately 3 seconds and made the calculation, not impulsively, not naively, but with the specific cold clarity of someone who had made calculations like that before, in places where being wrong had permanently unacceptable consequences. She picked up her phone and called Garrett. "I thought you should know," she said. "The defendant's counsel is approaching the DA about a plea. All counts." A pause. "That's faster than I expected." "The evidence is comprehensive." She paused. The injunction helped. It signaled that this wasn't going to be manageable quietly. "That was the point," Garrett said. After she hung up, Marsh sat for a long moment. She thought about the memo. She thought about the word unauthorized. She thought about a hospital administrator sitting in a safe building composing language designed to protect the institution from the consequences of sending an unarmed nurse into a situation that turned dangerous, and about how much of institutional life was this particular transaction. Risk transferred downward, credit retained upward, the actual cost absorbed by whoever was standing in the wrong place when the gate opened. She thought about the 11 people who had arrived in the morning and the 31 they had become by afternoon, and what it meant that a woman who had never asked for anything and had told almost no one where she'd come from had accumulated, entirely without effort, a community that moved for her while she was unconscious. She opened her laptop and started on the incident report. At 6:30 p.m., Dominic came out of his shift. He was wrung out in the specific way of people who have worked a full shift in a place where something significant is happening in the background, unable to fully engage with it, attending to the ordinary demands of the work, while the larger things sat in his peripheral vision all day. He changed out of his scrubs and stood in the locker room for a moment. He took out his phone. He had written, over the course of the afternoon, in increments between patients, a statement. He hadn't called it that in his head. He'd just started writing, in the Notes app, because Maya had told him to write things down, and this was a thing that needed to be written. It described his shift on the night of the incident. It described what Foyle had said, and to whom, and what he himself had observed in the courtyard door when the security team arrived. It described Maya, not in the language of tribute, which he didn't think she would want, but in the specific language of professional observation. What she noticed, how she worked, the IV in Leonard's arm, the EKG she'd flagged before Foyle saw it, the 2 years of quietly holding the floor together on nights when it would have been much easier not to. He sent it to Patricia, who had given him Garrett's contact information at 2 p.m. with the brief instruction to write down exactly what he knew. He put his phone away and walked out of the locker room and went upstairs to the ICU family waiting area because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. Sandra Reeves was there. She had come out for coffee, real coffee, not the machine, and she was standing with a cup in her hands, looking at nothing, doing the particular thing people did in waiting rooms where the waiting had gone on long enough to become its own kind of work. She looked at him when he came in. She didn't know him. "Dominic Yates," he said. "I work with Maya." Nights. Sandra looked at him, at his face, at the fact that he was there after his shift, and something in her expression shifted. She talks about the people she works with, she said. She doesn't talk much, but when she does. She paused. She mentioned a young nurse she was teaching. Dominic sat down. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. They sat in the quiet of the waiting room, and the building around them held the sounds of a hospital in early evening. Shift changes, the distant PA system, the particular rhythm of an institution that does not stop for anything, not even for the people inside it who need it to. After a few minutes, Sandra said, "She's going to be angry when she wakes up." Dominic looked at her. About what happened? About all of it. Sandra turned the coffee cup in her hands. She doesn't like this. A gesture that encompassed the room, the floor, the hospital, the state of being the person things are happening to, rather than the person managing them. She's going to wake up, and she's going to want to get up, and she's going to fight the doctors about it, and she's going to be furious that she's here and not on the floor, and she's going to ask 100 questions that nobody's going to want to answer because she'll see through every careful thing anyone says. Sandra's voice was dry and tired, and exactly right. She's been like that since she was 7. Dominic thought about Maya telling him to write it down at 2 a.m. in the medication room when he was shaking, the complete matter-of-factness of it. The total absence of performance. "I know," he said. At 8:15 p.m., Warren was still in the building. He had been informed by Garrett at 7:30 that the nursing board inquiry had been withdrawn and the internal review suspended, and that the hospital's legal counsel had reached out, very carefully, to open a dialogue about resolution. Warren had said, "What resolution looks like is not my decision. It's hers." Garrett had noted this and said he would preserve that position in all subsequent communications. Warren sat near the window in the lobby, which had become, over the course of the day, something between a waiting room and a vigil. The number had held at around 30. Some had come and gone, people with jobs and children and lives that couldn't be suspended indefinitely. But the number had not dropped below 25 since late afternoon. Meals had appeared from somewhere. He didn't investigate the logistics. Dax was with him, fed and watered and considerably more settled than he had been in the ER 2 nights ago. At 8:20, Corden came back downstairs. Warren watched him cross the lobby. Corden was a trim man in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the practiced confidence of someone who had managed institutions long enough to believe that everything was manageable. That confidence had been slightly dented by the afternoon's events, which was visible in something around the eyes. He stopped in front of Warren. "Mr. Okafor," he said. "Mr. Corden." Corden looked at the assembled people in the lobby. His expression was doing something complicated. "I want to assure you that the hospital takes Ms. Reeves' situation extremely seriously." "I know you do," Warren said. "Now." The 2 words landed in the space between them with a quietness that was worse than volume. Corden was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want?" Warren looked at him. "I want her to wake up," he said. "Everything else will follow from that." Corden held his gaze. He seemed about to say something further, then appeared to think better of it. He nodded, a real nod, not a performance, and went back to the elevator. Warren watched him go. At 9:47 p.m., Dr. Pell came to the ICU waiting room. Sandra was there. Dominic was there. Patricia, who had stayed well past any professional obligation, was there. 3 of the people from downstairs, including DeLuca, had been given visitor passes and were in the corridor. Dr. Pell stood in the doorway. "Her numbers have improved significantly in the last 2 hours," she said. "The arrhythmia has not recurred. The inflammation markers are continuing to drop." She paused, with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned the cost of premature certainty. "I'm cautiously optimistic. If she continues on this trajectory through the night, I would expect to begin reducing sedation in the morning." The room was very quiet. Sandra pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she put her hand down and said, in an entirely steady voice, "Thank you." Dr. Pell nodded and left. The room remained quiet. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of something, but the presence of a specific kind of relief. Tentative, careful, not yet willing to become anything larger, because the night was long and cautiously optimistic was not the same as certain. Dominic stared at the floor. DeLuca put her hands in her pockets. Patricia looked at the ceiling with an expression she was working to keep neutral. Nobody said anything. They didn't need to. The night settled over Greystone Regional Medical Center. In the ICU, Maya Reeves's monitors held their steady rhythms. Sandra dozed in the chair, her daughter's hand in her lap. The night nurse moved quietly through the room on her checks without disturbing either of them. In the lobby below, the number had come down to 18. They arranged themselves as people do for a long wait, stretched out on waiting room chairs, heads tipped back, some sleeping in the particular anywhere-is-fine way of people with field experience. The front desk staff had, somewhere around 10 p.m., stopped pretending to wonder what to do about them and simply let them be. In a jail cell across Pelham Falls, Curtis Brawl lay on his bunk with his surgically repaired arm in a cast and a set of charges that his attorney had confirmed, with clinical directness, were not going to improve with time or argument. The plea timeline was being discussed. The numbers being discussed were not in his favor. He stared at the ceiling and said nothing. In his home office, Dr. Garrison Foyle had been on the phone for 2 hours with the hospital's general counsel, who was navigating with increasing delicacy the question of what Foyle's role in the night's events meant for his continued presence in the hospital's trauma-attending roster. The conversation had not concluded. It was ongoing in the way that conversations become when all of the easy options have been exhausted and what remains are only the less comfortable ones. At 11:55 p.m., Garrett sent Warren a final message for the night. The nursing board withdrawal was confirmed in writing, the internal review was formally suspended rather than merely informally paused, and the hospital's council had agreed in preliminary conversation to a framework that would include a formal institutional acknowledgement of Maya Reeves's conduct as within the bounds of her professional responsibility. The language was still being negotiated, but the architecture of it existed. Warren read the message. He thought about architecture, about what gets built and what gets dismantled, and what remains after both. He sent back, "Good. Keep going in the morning." He put the phone away. Dax settled his head on Warren's knee. Warren put his hand on the dog's neck. In the dark, in the lobby of a hospital where a woman he still hadn't spoken to was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, and with significant opposition from her own body, to come back. He was still sitting there when his phone buzzed again. Not Garrett this time. A different number. One he didn't immediately recognize from a Maryland area code. He picked up. "This is Warren," he said. A pause. A voice. Not familiar. Male, middle-aged, something in the delivery that he couldn't locate precisely, but that snagged on something in his attention. "Mr. Okafor, I got your number from a mutual contact." Another pause. "My name is Daniel Fossey. I'm a journalist. I'm with the Baltimore Register." The voice was careful, preemptive. "I want to be honest with you. I've been aware of the situation at Greystone since early afternoon. I have sources inside the hospital. I've been holding the story out of consideration for the patient's privacy and the ongoing legal process." Warren said nothing. He waited. "But I've received something in the last hour," Fossey said, "that I think you need to know about before it becomes public. Because once I verify it, and I will verify it, I'm going to have to run it." The lobby was quiet around Warren, 18 people sleeping in various postures of patience, the front desk dim and slow. "What did you receive?" Warren said. "A document," Fossey said, "from an anonymous source inside the hospital's administrative structure. It's a communication from Harwell's office, dated 2 weeks before the incident." A pause that had weight in it. "Mr. Okafor, it references Maya Reeves specifically. It's a chain of emails between Harwell and Dr. Foyle discussing terminating her employment. Not because of anything she'd done wrong, because she'd filed an internal complaint 4 months ago about working conditions in the ER, about understaffing, and Dr. Foyle was informed." The voice was level, professional, giving him the information without the performance of outrage. The disciplinary review they launched after the attack wasn't reactive. It was the continuation of something that was already in motion. Warren sat very still. "The document," he said, "is authenticated?" "I'm in the process. It'll be done by morning." "And you're calling me because you have standing in this situation," Fossey said. "And because whoever is in that lobby with you tonight, I have a photograph from outside the hospital, taken at 4 this afternoon. I think you should know what you're actually defending her against." Warren looked at the elevator. He looked at the doors, beyond which, 2 floors up, a woman was beginning to recover from an attack that had been, in every official account, a random act of violence by a man with a grievance and a knife. And now there was a document, dated 2 weeks before the gate opened. He said slowly, "Send me a copy." The file came through 40 seconds later. Warren opened it. He read the first email, Harwell to Foyle, the subject line a dry administrative euphemism, and then he stopped reading and simply held the phone. Outside, a truck moved through the empty street. The lobby was quiet. Dax breathed steadily against his leg. Warren Okafor had spent most of his adult life in situations that looked one way from the outside and another way entirely from within, and he had developed, through years of that specific education, a precise sensitivity to the moment when the full shape of something becomes visible, when what looked like a coincidence revealed itself as a structure, when what looked like a reaction revealed itself as a plan that had been in motion long before the event that appeared to trigger it. The email in front of him was dated November 3rd. Maya Reeves had been in that courtyard on January 14th. The gate had opened. The knife had come out. And a hospital that had already decided to remove her had watched it happen and then picked up a pen and found in the attack not a tragedy to address, but an instrument to use. A cleaner, faster mechanism for what they had already been building toward for 4 months. His jaw was tight. His hand, around the phone, was steady. He dialed Garrett. "I know it's midnight," he said when Garrett answered on the second ring. "Read what I'm sending you, then tell me what we can do with it by morning." Garrett read the document in 12 minutes. Warren knew this because he sat in the lobby and watched the time and counted, and at the 12-minute mark his phone rang. "Okay," Garrett said. His voice had the clipped quality of a man who had moved past his initial reaction and was already in the operational space beyond it. "This changes the character of everything we filed today. The injunction was defensive, protecting her from a retaliatory action. This document makes it premeditated. There's a meaningful legal difference." "What can we do with it?" "A lot, but it depends on authentication, which is the journalist's problem until it isn't. If Fossey publishes and the document is verified, it becomes part of the public record. At that point, we can reference it in expanded litigation." A pause. "But Warren, I want to be careful here. This woman is still sedated. She hasn't consented to any of this. The injunction was defensive enough that I feel comfortable we were protecting her interests without overreach. Full litigation is a different step." Warren had been thinking about this since the call ended. He had been thinking about a woman who had spent 7 years in the Army and 3 years in a hospital and had, apparently, filed an internal complaint 4 months ago about understaffing, not about her own working conditions specifically, but about the conditions that affected patient care. He had read that detail in the second email, the one from Harwell to Foyle, confirming the complaint source. The Reeves complaint specifically identifies bay coverage gaps and inadequate triage staffing as patient safety risks. Not, "I am being treated unfairly." Patient safety risks. She hadn't been trying to protect herself. She had been trying to protect the people in the beds. "Keep it defensive," Warren said. "Build the framework. When she wakes up, she decides." "And if Fossey publishes before she wakes up?" "Then she wakes up to a world that already knows, which is different from us making that choice for her." He paused. "She's a grown woman who survived 2 combat deployments. She doesn't need us deciding what she can handle." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Fair," he said. They ended the call. Warren sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the elevator, which was carrying exactly no one at this hour, its doors opening and closing with the mechanical patience of a thing that did not get tired. He thought about what it meant to spend a career making careful, low-visibility decisions on behalf of people who would never know your name. He had done it himself, in different rooms, with different stakes. He understood the particular discipline of it, the way you learn to absorb recognition and its absence with equal equanimity, because the work didn't change based on whether anyone was watching. What he had not fully understood, until this week, was what it cost over a long time. Not the dramatic cost, not the wounds and the deployments and the things that made it into redacted incident reports. The other cost, the daily, accumulated weight of being perpetually underestimated by people who controlled your professional existence. The specific exhaustion of having to prove, over and over, in small moments that nobody recorded, that you were exactly as capable as you had always been. He put the phone in his pocket and leaned his head back and looked at the ceiling of a hospital lobby at midnight. Dax put his head on Warren's knee. "I know," Warren said. The morning came in gray and cold, the way January mornings in Pelham Falls always did, without apology. At 6:10 a.m., Dr. Pell began the process of reducing Maya Reeves's sedation. It was not a switch being flipped. It was a careful, incremental adjustment. Medications dialed back in precise degrees, the body given room to begin its own return. The monitors watched with the attention of people who knew that emergence from sedation after significant trauma was its own kind of event, unpredictable at the margins. Some patients surfaced smoothly. Some fought. Some went somewhere in between, caught briefly in the confused space between chemical sleep and consciousness, where the brain was running on biology again but hadn't yet reassembled the full narrative of where it was and why. Sandra was there. She had woken at 5 a.m. from the chair, stiff and disoriented, and she had washed her face in the small bathroom down the hall and come back and sat down and been there when Dr. Pell arrived. It could take several hours, Pell told her, or longer. There's no reliable timeline on this. Sandra nodded. She poured the last of the terrible machine coffee into a cup and held it and waited, which was what she had become expert at over the preceding days. At 7:30 a.m., Dominic arrived for his shift. He was at the nursing station when Patricia intercepted him. "Fosse's article published," she said low. 20 minutes ago. He looked at her. "How bad is it?" "For the hospital." She held his gaze. "It's accurate, which is worse." The Baltimore Register's digital edition had gone live at 7:08 a.m. with a story whose headline was precise and unadorned. Internal documents reveal Greystone Regional Medical Center sought to terminate nurse weeks before she was stabbed protecting a military service animal. The piece was 1,400 words. It was sourced, documented, and careful in exactly the way that made it resistant to legal challenge. It named Harwell. It named Foyle in the specific context of the November email chain. It quoted the internal complaint Maya had filed in September, the patient safety complaint, the one about staffing coverage gaps, in full. By 9 a.m., it had been picked up by 4 regional outlets. By 10 a.m., 2 national ones. Corden was in his office by 7:45. The meeting he called included the hospital's communications director, its legal counsel, and Harwell, who arrived looking like a man who had not slept and was now reckoning with the specific vertigo of watching a decision he had made in the controlled privacy of his office become a matter of public record. The meeting lasted 2 hours. What came out of it was not, at its core, a strategy. It was the acknowledgement, arrived at painfully and by stages, that there was no strategy available that didn't begin with the same first step, accountability. The communications director said it aloud at the 40-minute mark, when the third approach had been proposed and rejected. "We can't litigate this. Every document they have is real. Every email is real. The complaint is real. The timeline is real. The attack is real." She put her pen down. "We have to get ahead of it." Harwell looked at the table. "That means a statement," the director continued. "Today. It means formal recognition of what Ms. Reeves did and what the hospital's response should have been. And it means personnel accountability." She paused carefully. "Both of you need to understand what that phrase will mean in this specific instance." The room was very quiet. Corden looked at Harwell. Harwell did not look up from the table. At 10:15 a.m., Foyle submitted his resignation. It was not requested, technically, but the conversation with the general counsel that had run from the previous night into the early morning had arrived at a place where the voluntary option was being clearly presented as preferable to the alternative, and Foyle had the legal sophistication to understand the distinction. He wrote the letter himself, in his office, in the spare factual language of a man who had spent his professional life using language precisely and was not going to compromise that practice even now. He was 61 years old. He had been in medicine for 35 years. He had, in that time, done real work. Difficult cases, long nights, technical decisions that had saved lives. None of that was erased by what he had done over the past 3 years to Maya Reeves, or by the November email, or by the night he had handed her a lead and told her to deal with it. But none of it was sufficient to balance those things either, and he was not, at his core, a man capable of fully pretending otherwise. He put the letter in an envelope and left it on his desk and walked out of the hospital without stopping to speak to anyone. Patricia saw him leave from the nursing station. She watched him cross the lobby, past the people who were still there, who had been there all night, who did not know who he was and would not have moved for him if they had, and pushed through the main doors into the January air. She turned back to her station. There was work to do. There was always work to do. Well, at 11:30 a.m., Maya Reeves opened her eyes. It wasn't dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic, a slow, incremental return, her eyes opening partway and then closing again, then opening a little wider, the pupils contracting against the room's light, the face around them doing the effortful work of becoming present. Sandra was holding her hand and felt the change before she saw it. The slight increase in grip pressure, involuntary, the body signaling before the mind arrived. "Maya," Sandra said quietly. The eyes opened, unfocused at first, moving across the ceiling with the calibration effort of someone assembling information from scratch. Then the focus landed. On the ceiling, then on the monitor, then on the IV line, processing. The face registered recognition without relief, which was the specific response of someone who understood immediately where they were and why. Her lips moved. No sound. "Don't," Sandra said. "Tube's out, but your throat is going to be raw. Don't try to talk yet." Maya looked at her mother. Something in her face shifted. Not the full range of emotion, because her body was a long way from that, but the particular expression of someone who sees a face they were not certain they would see again and has a complicated relationship with what that means. She closed her eyes, opened them again. Sandra reached up and brushed a piece of hair back from her daughter's forehead, a gesture so automatic it bypassed the 10 years of her daughter's adult life in which that gesture would have been unwelcome, and Maya didn't pull away. Dr. Pell arrived 8 minutes later. She checked the monitors, assessed Maya's responsiveness, asked a series of questions Maya answered with small nods and head shakes, and when the preliminary assessment was done, she stood at the bedside and said, in her direct and unadorned way, "You're going to have a long recovery, but you're going to have it." Maya looked at her with the exhausted, unimpressed expression of someone too depleted for false gratitude. "There's a lot of information waiting for you," Pell said, "about what happened after the incident. We're going to take that slowly." Something shifted in Maya's eyes, a question forming. "The man who attacked you is in custody," Pell said. "The dog is fine. The patient, the one you were watching the dog for, he's also recovering." She paused. "The rest of it can wait until you're stronger." Maya's jaw tightened slightly. Pell recognized the expression. "Or," Pell said with something close to dry humor, "your mother can tell you, which she will, regardless of what I recommend." Sandra made a sound that was not quite a laugh. They told her in pieces over the course of the afternoon. Sandra first sitting beside the bed, speaking in the measured and practical tone she'd developed for delivering difficult information to a daughter who did not respond well to being managed. She covered the immediate facts: the surgery, the arrhythmia, the recovery trajectory. She covered Brawl and the arrest. She covered Dax, because Maya asked about Dax with her eyes before she asked anything else, and Sandra had anticipated this. Dominic came in at 2 p.m. briefly because the nurses on Maya's floor had established a visiting schedule among themselves with the informal authority of people who understood what the situation required. He stood at the end of the bed looking slightly uncertain, the way people look when they've rehearsed what they'll say and then found the room different from the rehearsal. Maya looked at him. Her voice, when she used it, was raw and slower than usual. "You stayed," she said. Not a question. Yeah. He didn't explain further. There wasn't more to say. The IV, she said. Leonard. He blinked. What? Bay 9. The IV you couldn't get. Her voice was labored, but the mind behind it was clearly running at its own speed. Did you write it down? Dominic looked at her for a moment, and something in his chest did something complicated. Yeah, he said. I did. She nodded once. Her eyes closed briefly, not from discomfort, but from the effort of maintaining concentration. Good, she said. He left before she could see his expression. Garrett came at 4 p.m., alone, with a folder he didn't open immediately. He introduced himself and gave her the minimum necessary context: the injunction, the nursing board withdrawal, the status of the hospital's review. In the economical language of someone who understood that she was managing pain and limited stamina and didn't need his voice-filling space it didn't need to fill. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The emails, she said. The November ones. You know about them. I figured there was something. Her jaw set in a way that made her wince because that particular muscle movement pulled on things that weren't ready for it. Harwell stopped making eye contact with me in September, right after I filed the complaint. Garrett looked at her. You noticed? I notice everything, she said, not with pride. Just as a statement of fact, the same way she might say I have 2 hands. What are they offering? He outlined it. The formal acknowledgement, the personnel accountability, Foyle's resignation, which had been made public as of an hour ago, the framework for addressing the staffing issues she'd raised in her complaint, a financial settlement offer that was preliminary but substantial. Maya listened. Her face was difficult to read, which Garrett suspected was its default state. The staffing issue, she said. Is it in writing? That they'll actually address it, with a timeline and specific metrics. Not yet. That's negotiable. That's not negotiable, she said. That's the part that matters. She paused, and the effort of the conversation was visible now. Not weakness exactly, but the body making its accounting known. People were getting hurt because of the coverage gaps. Before any of this happened, that's why I filed the complaint. So if they want a settlement, that piece is concrete and binding and comes with oversight, or we don't settle. Garrett wrote it down. One more thing, he said. Warren Okafor. He's been asking if he can come up. The name didn't register immediately. It hadn't been used in the immediate context of who owned the dog, and then she connected it and was still for a moment. The patient, she said. Yes. Maya looked at the window. Outside, the January sky was making its early exit toward dark. She thought about a gate opening. She thought about amber eyes finding her face in a hospital courtyard and the specific transaction of stillness and trust that had moved between her and an animal she didn't know. Tell him yes, she said. Warren came up at 5 p.m. He moved carefully, his body still carrying its own recovering weight. And he came in without Dax because Dax was not, on this particular afternoon, cleared for the ICU floor, which was a conversation that Tara had had with Patricia and that had been resolved in favor of protocol for the moment. He stood at the door of room 14 and knocked on the open frame. Maya turned her head. He was not what she expected, which she realized meant she'd been forming an expectation without knowing it. He was older than she'd imagined, and harder looking, with a face that had the particular topography of someone who had spent significant time outdoors in difficult conditions. He was also, visibly, still not entirely well, which she noted because she was trained to note it and because there was something clarifying about it. 2 people in the same building, both in various stages of not being fine, neither of them requiring the other to pretend otherwise. He sat in the chair Sandra had vacated. Sandra had gone to the cafeteria for dinner, under instruction from Maya, who had said, go eat actual food with enough residual authority that Sandra had gone. Warren looked at her. She looked at him. I'm sorry, he said, for what happened to you. You didn't do it. You were in that courtyard because of me. I was in that courtyard because Foyle told me to be. Her voice was flat, not harsh. And I would have stayed there anyway. Dax was scared. Warren looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. He's not scared anymore. Something in Maya's face moved briefly and then settled. "What's he like?" she said. "Normally." Warren thought about this. It was not the question he had expected, which made him find the actual answer rather than a performed one. "Stubborn," he said. "Smart in ways that are inconvenient. He wants to work more than his age allows. He forgets sometimes that he's retired." Maya made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh and stopped because laughing, currently, was not a thing her torso was permitting. "That's a personality I recognize," she said. They looked at each other. "What are you going to do?" Warren said. "After." She understood that after meant after recovery, after settlement, after whatever the next several months were going to be. It was a large question, and he was asking it directly, which she appreciated. "I'm going to go back to work," she said. "Here?" She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was that she didn't know yet. The hospital she was returning to would not be the same hospital she had left 2 nights ago, and she was not sure whether that was sufficient. She was aware that Foyle was gone. She was aware that the staffing issues she had spent 4 months fighting through proper channels and making no visible progress on were suddenly in binding negotiations as part of a legal settlement. She was aware that outside this building, at some point today, 30-something people had stood in a lobby for her without being asked. She had not fully absorbed what that meant. She wasn't going to, not today. The body she was living in right now had a limited budget for large realizations. "Somewhere," she said. "I'm going to go back to work somewhere." Warren nodded. He stood carefully. "Dax wanted to come up," he said. "They wouldn't let him." "I figured." "He knows you're here." He said it simply, without dressing it up. "He's been oriented toward the elevator all day." Maya looked at the window again. Outside, the last of the January light was gone now, and the city was doing what cities did in the dark, carrying on, indifferent and necessary, full of people who were in their own rooms dealing with their own versions of gates opening when they didn't expect them to. "Tell him I'm coming," she said. But the weeks that followed were not easy, and Maya didn't expect them to be. Recovery was the specific kind of hard that didn't improve with willpower, the kind that required, instead, the daily practice of accepting limitation without making peace with it. She was a bad patient in every predictable way. She argued with the physical therapist about the timeline for returning to full activity. She asked Dr. Pell pointed questions about every medication adjustment. She read every document Garrett sent her and returned it annotated, and the annotations were specific and difficult, and they made the final settlement considerably better than the first draft. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday morning in February, 6 weeks after the attack. It contained everything she had demanded, in writing, with timelines and oversight mechanisms. The staffing gaps she had identified in September were addressed through a binding agreement to hire 4 additional nursing staff for the night ER shift, with quarterly reviews by an independent oversight committee that included a seat for a nursing staff representative. The hospital issued a formal public statement, not a vague institutional expression of regret, but a specific acknowledgement that Maya Reeves had acted within the full scope of her professional and personal responsibility on the night of the incident, that the subsequent administrative actions had been inappropriate, and that her conduct had reflected the highest standard of care. Corden read it at a press conference. His voice was steady. His hands, the communications director noted privately, were not. Harwell had resigned the same week as Foyle under different circumstances, a board decision made quietly, with the specific efficiency of institutions removing things that have become liabilities. He landed somewhere, eventually. They always did. But he was not at Greystone when Maya came back. Curtis Brawl accepted the plea agreement on a Friday in late February. He entered guilty pleas on all counts: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, premeditated attack on a federally designated service animal, and the enhanced charge that came from weeks of documented surveillance. The sentencing hearing lasted 2 hours. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named the Honorable R. Calloway, read the sentence with the even delivery of someone who had made her assessment and was not interested in debating it. 17 years. Brawl looked at the table when the number landed. He did not speak. His attorney did not move. Detective Marsh, sitting in the gallery with her notebook closed because there was nothing left to write, looked at the man who had followed an ambulance to a hospital with a fixed blade and stood in the empty courtyard with his arm in a cast and his face arranged into nothing, and she thought about the specific arrogance it took to believe that the world was populated by softer things than you, by people who would yield, by women in scrubs who could be counted on to step back when a voice told them to. She collected her things and left before the formalities concluded. She had cases waiting. But Maya returned to nursing in March. Not to Greystone. She had applied to and been offered a position at Hargrove Medical Center on the other side of Pelham Falls, a Level 2 trauma center with a night ER that was, according to its charge nurse, Patricia had made inquiries through channels, decently staffed and run with something approximating functional respect for the people working the floor. The pay was marginally better. The commute was longer. The coffee machine worked. On her first shift, she arrived 45 minutes early, because she had always arrived early and saw no reason to change that. She changed in the locker room, laced her left shoe twice, clipped her badge, and walked out to the floor. The charge nurse met her at the station. His name was Jerome, 50s, unhurried, with the particular economy of someone who had been doing this long enough to know what deserved energy and what didn't. "Reeves," he said. "Heard good things." "From who?" she said. "Patricia Rodriguez. You know her?" Maya clipped her badge clip one more time, though it didn't need it. "Yeah," she said. "I know her." Jerome handed her the first chart. "Bay 3 is yours. Suspected pneumothorax, the x-ray is queued. Let me know what you think before the attending gets there." Maya took the chart. She read it on the way to Bay 3. She was already thinking about the patient, about what they needed, about the specific sequence of assessments she would run and in what order and the rest of it. The settlement, the press, the 17-year sentence, the lobby full of people she had never thanked and wasn't sure how to. Receded to where it lived now, which was somewhere she could access when she needed to and set aside when there was work. There was always work. She pushed back the curtain and introduced herself to the patient in Bay 3, a 48-year-old man named Robert, who was nervous and in pain and trying not to show either. "I'm Maya," she said. "I'm going to take care of you." She meant it the way she had always meant it, not as a reassurance, not as a performance, but as an operational statement of intent. She was going to take care of him, because that was what she was here for, because that was what she had rebuilt herself into after the deployments and the discharge and the years of learning to live in a body that had been through things and carried them without being defined by them. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The difference now was that the people around her knew it, not because she had changed, but because they had finally paid attention. 3 weeks into her time at Hargrove, she received a message from Warren. He was brief, because brevity was his natural register. He said Dax was doing well. He said the Meridian Group's former connection to Brawl's employer was being reviewed. Not publicly, and he didn't elaborate, and that some professional situations had a way of resolving that didn't require visibility to be real. He said he hoped the new position was better than the last one. At the end, he wrote, "He still knows which direction your building is." Maya read the message twice. She was in the break room between patients, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee that was actually good, which still surprised her at random intervals. She wrote back, "Tell him the food is better here." He made the right call. She put her phone away and went back to the floor. She did not think about the gate. She did not think about the knife, or the concrete, or the specific quality of cold that had come up fast at the end of it. She did not think about the 11 weeks of recovery, or the settlement negotiations, or the morning she had read the November emails for the first time and sat with the specific, clean anger of it before filing it somewhere she could manage it. She thought about Bay 7, which needed her. She thought about the patient in Bay 7 who did not know her history and would not need to, who needed someone who was present and skilled and paying attention. She walked down the hall. There is a particular kind of person the world tends to underestimate, not because they are small, but because they are quiet, because they do not announce their capacity, because they have learned through the specific education of difficult experience that strength which requires an audience isn't really strength at all. It's performance. And performance, when the gate actually opens, is the first thing to go. What remains is the other thing, the thing that doesn't need to be seen to be real. Maya Reeves pushed back the curtain on Bay 7 and got to work.